Morning. So if you don't want your
where we are.
faces on this, we are recording this. Are we ready to go? I think we've only got half an hour, so I think we might, should we kick off, Sarah? And as it's just after
sure.
start time. Excellent. Okay. So if we pull up the slides, and just while we're doing that, maybe you'd like to kind of share in the chat which country you're from. Should be nice. We'll be using the chat just to share a few bits of information, and maybe also say, I don't know, yes, no, whether you're you work in the healthcare profession. It would be nice to know also if any of you are. Sarah will ask, I'll be kicking off, and Sarah will be picking up any comments or questions as we go along, and hopefully at the end of this session we'll have time to cover anything that if it's possible. So the title of the workshop is Solution Focused Approach in Healthcare Settings, How to Share Expertise when Giving Expert Advice. And it's something that often comes up with Sarah and I. We are healthcare professionals, as we're known in England, the UK, allied health professionals. There were speech and language therapists, but there are obviously many other allied health professionals such as OTs, occupational therapists, physiotherapists, dietitians, and so on. And we have different expertise, obviously, all of us, and it's really a question of how do we do our role in hospital settings or wherever it is that we practice, and also try to work in a solution-focused way. So we hope that this workshop will kind of cover a few of the points that we want to talk about. So Sarah, the next slide.
Let me just go.
A little bit about ourselves. So as I say, I'm a speech and language therapist. I've worked at different hospitals and for the NHS for 23 years, Chelsea and Westminster for 19 years. And since 2016, I've been focusing more as a solution-focused practitioner independently in the voluntary sector as a trainer and supervisor. Sarah is at City University in London. She's a senior lecturer there and has done some wonderful work working with people with aphasia and using solution-focused practice. And I really encourage you to check out the Sophia website to find out a bit more about the research that she's been doing, which is really impressive and wonderful work. And together we have written a new book, which actually came out 2 weeks ago, covering some of these topics. Obviously, there are many other areas that we look into. There's a nice introduction to solution-focused brief therapy generally, and a chapter on supervision. But today we really hope to look at 3 specific areas. So Sarah, if you go on to the next slide, I'll outline what those are. The hat there, that's our solution-focused hat. So with those on, our best hopes is to be able to talk a bit about how we can fulfill our role in assessment, advice giving, and rehabilitation exercises in a solution-focused way. And to start off, of course, to say that if we ask for advice, of course, we're going to give it. It would be unethical not to give that. But the main focus here is that, is there a way of doing these things that often we have to do in a more solution-focused way? And we'll be asking for any ideas and suggestions you have, and sharing some of the ones that we have come up with. So I'll pass on to Sarah, who will start off with the first topic. Thanks, Sarah.
Yes, hi, it's really lovely to be here today, and thank you for the introduction, Kidge. And it's great to see people from all over the world. So it's lovely to see you coming in from Malaysia, Australia, coming in from the UK as well. So it'd be nice to get different people's perspectives on these ideas from your own settings. As Kidge says, I'm a speech and language therapist. So my background is working with people with stroke and people who have language difficulties after the stroke. And a big part of the speech therapy role is these areas of assessment. and advice giving. And it was something that Kidge and I have thought a lot about, of how best to do this in a solution focused way. So I thought I would start off by just reflecting a little bit, I guess. I've trained about 20 years ago, and when I trained, it was very much an expert-led medical model that we were trained in. And seeing how that has evolved a little bit in the UK to become more solution focused in a sense, but still some of these areas which are still quite difficult to do in a solution focused way within a more medical model setting. So when I trained, the pathway was very much that people presented with a problem. And then it was my role as a speech and language therapist to sort of assess the deficits, see what was wrong, what the pattern of the problem was, and provide some kind of diagnosis potentially. And then from my expert diagnosis, I would then prescribe some treatment, which I thought might address the problem or reduce the problem. And then I might measure outcomes to see to what extent the problem as I saw it had been reduced. So that was how I was trained 20 years ago. And since then, I think things have been shifting. So within stroke in the UK, and there's a couple of you tuning in from the UK, the best practice is now that rather than me set goals as the expert, it's much more collaborative goal setting, which starts to feel much more solution focused, and that the goals should be meaningful and relevant to the client. So it's their perspective is increasingly part of the story in the UK. And then within the aphasia world, so this is people who have language difficulties after something like a stroke, there was a recent shift where there was a sense of maybe we should be doing the goal setting before we start doing the assessment so we can see what's important to someone. So again, starting to feel a little bit more solution focused. And increasingly, when I train my speech therapy students at City University, we're very much encouraging them to be assessing strengths as well as deficits. And this is quite a nice quote from the National Health Service in the UK around mental health, so that part of our values in the National Health Service should be a commitment to ensuring that mental health care is delivered in a person-centred, compassionate and supportive way that empowers people to build on their strengths. So I feel within the UK, it's going a lot of the solution focused ideas are becoming a little bit more embedded into mainstream practice. Still, the solution focused model looks a little different. So, when someone walks into a solution focused therapy room, we're meeting the person rather than starting off with a problem. We're exploring their best hopes, and we're having a sort of solution focused conversation, which is sharing expertise. So, I have my expertise as a speech and language therapist, they have their expertise in their own life. And that, I think Kit will agree, there's more and more speech and language therapists in the UK who are working with that model and finding that it can fit within the health service in the UK. But there's still a big part of our job which is still assessing, advising, and prescribing exercises. And some of the solution focused guidelines are very much, well, for these parts of our role, so within allied health professionals or social work or mental health nursing, yes, of course, they're a part of our role, but we take off our solution focused hat to do these parts of our role. And then we put it back on again to carry on with our solution focused thinking and our solution focused work. And I guess what Kidge and I were thinking, well, this is quite a big part of a speech therapist role. So is there a way we can do it in a more solution focused way? So that's the sort of start point for this talk. So to start off with assessment, I think assessment is something that I'm kind of probably particularly interested in. As a clinician, I was always interested in, well, how can I do assessment in a humane way that respects expertise? But particularly now my role is doing a lot of research, and there's a lot of assessment involved in research and intervention research. And it was something that was sort of on my mind. Well, how can I make these? I mean, the research assistants would go and see someone and they might do a whole 40 minutes of assessment with someone. So how can we do these assessments in a way that respects someone's humanity, if you like? How can we make this as solution focused as possible? So before I start off with, we'll share some of the ideas that Kidge and I have had, but just a thought exercise, I guess. Just thinking of a time when you carried out an assessment and you were able to incorporate some of that solution-focused mindset as part of the assessment process. So what helped you to be more solution-focused when you were doing an assessment while still keeping the integrity of the assessment? but how did you manage to incorporate some solution-focused principles into that? And potentially what difference did it make to your client? So I'll give you a moment to just reflect on your own practice. If you want to share any thoughts in the chat, please do. But at the same time, if you'd rather just sort of sit and sort of absorb what Kidge and I are saying and what other people might say in the chat, that's absolutely fine as well. So I'll just open up the chat. So there's a question in chat, what are we assessing against? So within within a research context, we would use a standardized assessment. So for example, we might be assessing how much someone is their well-being, and we would use a standardized assessment like the Warwick Edinburgh Mental Wellbeing Scale, and we might use that before and after someone's had an intervention. Within speech and language therapy, often we might be assessing their language to get a baseline look at what are the things that they find easy to do with their language profile and what's been affected by their stroke. You know, a physiotherapist might be assessing movement or whatever. So that's what I mean by assessment. But it may be that you're assessing students in an educational context, or you're assessing people within an interview context. So thank you for your question. So I'll move on to some of the thoughts that Kidge and I had about how what we've found has helped the process. So one of the first things I guess to say is we just checking whether our assessment fits with what the client is actually wanting from therapy. So if the client's focus for their therapy after a stroke is they really want to work on their reading, for example, then it makes sense to do some assessment around reading to help us make sure we can give them the best therapy that we can. But it's important to know that before we're going to do that, that is actually what they're wanting from therapy. So checking in with them first. And then a big thing that I've always done with clients is just sharing our rationale for conducting the assessment, so that it can be a sort of a shared and collaborative decision whether or not to carry it out. So why are we doing it? What difference is it going to make to the therapy that we can give them? Finding ways to highlight our respect for the client's competence and expertise. And something within research that I've been really keen that we make sure that we do, and it's something that's, I think we've succeeded, and it's come through in the interviews after the research, is that we're concerned about someone as a person, not just the numbers on an assessment chart, so that we're really listening to their answers when we ask a question. And I'm just seeing we got a couple of people who put something in the chat. So Anton, you said you love Günter Luger's way of using solution-focused assessments. He doesn't ask for one number on a scale, but for a range, and is interested in the differences between these numbers. Yeah, that's a really lovely way of exploring that. And someone's also given a nice reference in the chat. So so thank you for those contributions. And I'm just going to, I'm aware of time. Yes, and this is something that Kidge would always say, consider some solution-focused conversations before you do the assessment and hopefully afterwards as well. And with that, I'm going to pass over back to Kidge.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. And yes, just to underline when we're talking about these things that it would be unethical not to share information because when we're going on to advice now, it's important that if any risk is involved, of course, that has to be covered first and is very important. So how can we give advice in a solution-focused way? I'm very interested in this. Particularly, and another little kind of thought exercise that we thought we'd give you in the next slide to think about how you do that, and again to suggest ways that any suggestions that you might have to make. Sarah, if you want to go on to the next slide, please. we're going to share some of the ideas we've come up with. So do share that, and you know, if you do give advice, what kind of ways have you done it in a way that respects your client's expertise? So again, this is the solution focused thing, that, you know, giving advice obviously is us being expert led, which is what we try not to do more often or than we have to. So please, you know, put those in the chat if you'd like to. So on to some of the things that we've come up with. We're going to list here in the next one. Let's start with a couple here. So we really feel that rather than when somebody comes into the room and they come in with a diagnosis, say perhaps they've got Parkinson's disease, and we know a bit about that and have some suggestions in our field of communication, of language. We also cover swallowing, which is a big area with Parkinson's. Rather than go straight into saying, right, this is what you need to do, we put aside our knowledge first until we've heard the client's perspective of how is it that they're living with the condition, and kind of most importantly, of course, what are their best hopes from having a conversational therapy with us. And more than likely than not, they will have you know, have had already advice, but even before we get to that, if they want advice from us, they say, no, I want advice from you. We will ask the what difference question. What difference will it make to you having this advice now? A really, really important question. As always, that what difference question, I think, with advice giving and is really relevant here. The next couple of points. Yes, if they've got a chronic disease, they will have had a whole load of information advice probably before coming to see us. So what information have they already had? I think it's only respectful to ask rather than then repeat the same stuff. You're wasting their time if you're doing that, and finding out, you know, what has been useful to them already, and also perhaps what advice they give themselves, because that really indicates to us what is they feel is most relevant to their lives and their best fit for them. And perhaps, or another way of asking this, of course, is what advice would you give to someone else in a similar situation? We do have to remember that in the case of Parkinson's disease, they're the ones that have that, not us. And so they are the expert, truly the expert in many areas. We have, of course, expertise, but it is really about sharing this in the best possible way. And we like this idea of laying out our suggestions on the table. So if we get to this point where we're going to say, would it be useful for us to talk for 5 or 10 minutes about what ideas we have? We step out of the solution-focused framework and start putting on the table different ideas. And if we look at the next one, and the next one, please, Sarah, this thing that how even we introduce that and we say, well, some people have found X helpful, other people have found Y helpful. So it's rather than saying you need to do that, it's that sharing that we have experience of other people. This is what they found useful. And then it is then up to the client to decide what fits with what they're doing and how they're living their lives. So as I say, I think just a few little points here, but they really can make a difference to how the people take on the advice and might hear it for the first time in a better way for them, and so that they can move their lives forwards. Anything coming up in the chat, Sarah, that you want to comment on, that because I'm not in the chat at the moment.
Yes, no, thank you everyone for that people have been writing into the chat. So I might share those suggestions and ideas as well, if that's okay, Kidge. So Rod has said, working in a corporate environment, I try to present ideas as options, so a start of a discussion. And together we can shape it to fit their context, which is lovely and fits very much with I think what you've been saying, Kidge. And David in Australia, thank you for also sharing some of what you do. So first of all, you find out what advice they actually want, which is a really good start point, and rather than making assumptions. And secondly, you ask what might happen after we give the advice. So after we talk about the advice, what difference would it make? And again, using that lovely question, what difference? Anton, you've said whenever clients say they have XYZ as a diagnosis, that get Livev, I hope I've pronounced that right, always ask first, how is it for you to have that particular condition? So rather than making assumptions, and then ask them about what works for them to deal with it. So tapping into their expert perspective from the condition. And Susanna from Cornwall, you've commented that there's relief in knowing that they're with a professional, and that sometimes that can be the main best hope. So that sort of reassurance of what we're providing them as and just being able to give that space for them to have that conversations with a professional. And Ian Smith, I still always use, how would you change this to make it helpful as a default, which is a lovely question. So thank you everybody for all those lovely suggestions and questions. And it's really nice to see all the different perspectives from across the world, which is lovely. And I'll pass back over to Kidge.
I think it's on to you next, Sarah, with the next slide.
Ah, right, yes, it's on to rehabilitation exercises. So this is another thing that's a big part of speech and language therapy, and something we have expertise in. You know, what's the evidence base for different exercises to help people make progress in different areas? And it's something that I've reflected on a lot. And I think back to when I was newly qualified, and my very first job was working on the Isle of Wight, which is a very beautiful little island off the south coast of England, working with families of young children. And I just done my training, and I was quite a good speech therapist. I knew the theory about what would help families whose children were late talking or had speech difficulties, but I didn't know much about families. And I look back now and I think, well, a family would come along with a child, and I would give them, I'd give them good advice about what they could do and what they should be doing to help their child make progress. But it didn't always work. And I look back on it now and I just think, gosh, I didn't really get where they were coming from. Sometimes they were living with single parent with several kids in quite difficult circumstances. And I don't know if I really took that on board. And I guess their way of communicating with me was often, they wouldn't turn up to the next appointment. So we would have a do not attend. And at the time I was newly qualified, massive caseload. I used that time to catch up on admin. But now I look back and I just think, if only I had had some solution focused training, and I could have sort of thought, well, what's important to them? Where are they coming from? How is my advice going to fit with their life? How can I make sure that we meet each other and they can share their expertise and what their life is actually like, and how my expert knowledge can fit in with that usefully. And yes, of course, it was my role to share the evidence base, to share what kind of rehab exercises were going to be useful for them, but then check in with them, what do they think is going to be useful, and what are they looking for from the therapy, and ask them what's helped them carry out exercises in the past. Perhaps scale how confident they are to work on the suggested exercises, and explore how these are going to fit with the rest of their lives, how that's going to look with everything else they've got going on. And of course, sometimes take off our solution-focused hat while we're sharing different exercises, sharing our expert advice on what the evidence base is for what might help them make progress. And I see there's something in the chat, so I'll just quickly look at that. Okay, so this is Susanna. So I sometimes use DSM, which is a problem focused, as part of a mandatory assessment. I use the scale upside down, e.g. if you're on a wobbly ladder, 4 is the top and the ground is feeling okay. And how have you been feeling in the last 2 weeks? Also, that's a nice way of tapping into where they're up to at the moment. And I can see that could be really helpful. So thank you for sharing that. And I think that was me for rehabilitation exercises. I was now going to pass back over to Kidge, and I know we're wanting to keep you to time. So over to Kidge for the final little bit about sharing expertise.
Okay, so again, I'm afraid because of the only short time we have, it's going to have to be in your head, this one. I don't even know whether they're going to have time to check on the chat. But if you were thinking of this thing of sharing expertise, with 10 is that you carry out assessments if you do them, sharing expert advice or recommendations in the way that you like, and 0 is the opposite, where are you now? How come there and not lower? And what would you tell? What would tell you if you're 1 point higher? What else? What else? Who else would notice? So either think about that now if you want to share that, or where you feel you are, or to take away with you. Just a reflection myself, when I do this, it tends to be then that I focus on case examples, and I'm really keen that to share a couple of those with you. And really, I think the strength of our book is there are many case examples. The best way to explain this and to show what we do in a solution focused way is in transcripts, is in conversations. And to give you a couple then, Colin, who I saw, who had had a road traffic accident and had brain injury, was needed to come to see me. We had a solution focused conversation with his best hopes, and then the day after the miracle, where his best hopes were beginning to happen more for him. And in the next session, he came back and he started talking about strategies that he'd been doing. Now, we hadn't discussed those strategies in the first session. And what was so interesting that he came up with, I'll give you one example of at night time, he started folding his clothes on his chair before he got up to get up on time and get to work on time in the morning. Now, anybody who's dealt with brain injury knows that routine is very important. These are the kind of discussions I would have been having, but for himself, he had worked out that very small things like that were making a difference in his life. And I loved how the fact that they came from him rather than me needing to kind of structure that for him. Another one, which was Jake, who had a stammer, who was very insistent on strategies. So we stepped out of the solution focused practice. We did some breathing exercises, but in fact, of course, he didn't do them, which I think is an example of how can be quite discouraging for us when we do give advice, they're not followed. But it was the solution focused conversations that actually led to progress. And I did do an assessment at the end which showed progress, even though he still, and I think he always will be looking for more advice and strategies to help him, in his opinion, cure his stammer. And finally, we haven't touched on one of the really big areas which we also do, which is degenerative diseases. We talk about somebody, we have a transcript from Fred, who has got motor neuron disease, and anybody who knows that condition, it's a very serious degenerative disease where a lot of advice and information giving is needed. And he was adamant that he didn't want that. He, of course, needed to know where to access it if and when necessary. Swallowing was going to be a big area for him, which is an area that we cover. But it was the solution-focused conversations that were the most useful for him, that he most enjoyed and found helpful. And so I suppose, just to finish, just to go on to the last slide, as we're literally running out of time, it's just to say, yes, we do what we do. We do the assessments, give advice and exercises. But I think for not just for our clients, for us as therapists as well, solution-focused practice is so encouraging and helpful, because it helps support us and feel that we're doing what we're doing and more in a way that is just so important and needs to be done even more, I think, in the healthcare settings as well as others. So thank you for being here. And I hope if any of you are interested to have a look at the book, we'd love to hear from you if you've got any comments to make. And I don't know whether there's anything in the chat that you wanted to add to this, or anything else you wanted to say, Sarah, at this point.
Oh, it's been really lovely to come along, and it's so nice to have a kind of international talk with people from all over the world. So thank you very much for all your contributions in the chat, and I hope I did them justice in reading them out. And yeah, it's been a pleasure to start. It's quite early in the morning for us over here, so I know the time differences are all over the place with people from Malaysia and Australia. So for us, for Kidge and I, it's bright and bonny first thing in the morning, and a lovely sunny summer morning. But thank you very much for coming along and listening in all your different parts of the world.
Enjoy the rest of the day in the conference. Okay. Bye, everyone. Thanks for the comments. Lovely.
Harry Norman.
Was it a Harry I saw?
How the devil are you? Apart from being silenced. We can't hear you, Harry. Harry, your microphone's not working. There you go.
Hello.
Hello.
Are you the evil genius behind all this?
We're the silent operators behind